The hum of luxury engines filled the dealership as James Carter stepped inside. The high ceilings, gleaming white tiles, and immaculate display of cars screamed exclusivity. He adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored suit, his polished leather shoes clicking softly as he walked. Heads turned, but not in admiration. James noticed the subtle glances, the narrowing eyes, the slight furrows of brows, as though his presence disrupted the sterile environment. Behind the marble counter, Steve Miller, the dealership's owner, leaned back in his chair, a smirk plastered across his face as he scrolled through his phone. Spotting James, his demeanor shifted. His eyes scanned him from head to toe, lingering on the man's dark skin and impeccable attire. Steve's assistant, a nervous young man named Paul, whispered something, but Steve waved him off dismissively. "I got this," Steve muttered, standing and straightening his blazer. James approached the nearest car, a sleek black convertible, his fingers lightly grazing the polished hood. "Beautiful machine," James said, his voice calm and deliberate. Steve cleared his throat, stepping into James's view. "That's a model a bit out of range for most," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting Steve continue. "Maybe you'd prefer something more practical," Steve added, gesturing toward a smaller, less impressive sedan in the corner. "Reliable and affordable." James tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Interesting assumption. Do you always size up customers like this?" Steve crossed his arms, unbothered by the question. "Look, I've been in this business a long time. I can tell who's serious and who's here just to look around." "Is that so?" James replied, his tone neutral. Paul hovered nearby, clutching a clipboard, clearly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak but thought better of it, stepping back into the shadows. Steve motioned toward another section of the showroom. "The entry-level models are over there. If you're serious about buying, I can show you those. Otherwise," he let the sentence hang, his eyes narrowing slightly. James straightened, meeting Steve's gaze without a flicker of emotion. "I'd like to test drive this one," he said, nodding toward the convertible. Steve laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed uncomfortably. "Test drive? Sir, we don't let just anyone take these cars out. Company policy." "Company policy?" James repeated, his voice calm but with a steel edge. Steve shrugged. "We reserve test drives for pre-qualified buyers." "And how exactly do you determine who's qualified?" Steve leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Well, let's just say it's about knowing your clientele." James let the silence stretch between them, his eyes locked on Steve's. The smirk on Steve's face faltered slightly. "I see," James said finally, his voice even. "And you're certain about that policy?" Steve clapped his hands together. "Absolutely. You wouldn't want to waste your time on something you can't take home, right? Tell you what, why don't you look around, and when you're ready, we can talk financing options." "Financing," James repeated, his voice dry. "Yes, financing," Steve said, oblivious to the edge in James's tone. Paul shifted awkwardly, glancing between the two men. "Mr. Miller," he began hesitantly, "maybe we should—" "Paul," Steve snapped, cutting him off. "Handle the paperwork for Mr. Chin. I've got this under control." Paul hesitated but nodded, scurrying off toward the office. James stepped closer to the car, his reflection clear in its pristine surface. "You know, Mr. Miller," he said, turning to face the owner, "I've visited many dealerships. It's always fascinating to see how each one operates." Steve chuckled nervously. "Well, we pride ourselves on our exclusivity. We cater to a very specific clientele. That's why we're known for quality, not just quantity." "Quality," James repeated, his gaze sharp. "And what does quality look like to you?" Steve hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "Well, our customers appreciate the finer things. They're, discerning." "Discerning," James said, nodding slowly. Steve's confidence returned. "Exactly. That's why I know who's serious and who's, well, just here to window shop." James let out a low chuckle, the sound making Steve shift uncomfortably. "Fascinating perspective," James said. "Tell me, How often does that perspective cost you business? Steve frowned, the smirk on his face slipping. Excuse me? Never mind, James said, stepping back. Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller. I'll take my business elsewhere. Steve watched him go, his lips twitching as if to speak, but he said nothing. Paul emerged from the office, his eyes wide as he watched James leave. Steve, Paul said quietly, are you sure about? Paul, Steve interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't start. People like him don't buy cars like these. End of story. Paul looked toward the door, his expression troubled. I don't think he was just anyone, he murmured. Doesn't matter, Steve said, brushing him off. He's not coming back. But James Carter always came back. And when he did, it wouldn't be as a dismissed customer. It would be as the man who controlled the very future of that dealership. The next morning, the dealership buzzed with its usual energy. Sales associates darted between desks, paperwork in hand, while customers admired the gleaming cars under the soft showroom lights. Steve Miller, as usual, sat in his office, basking in the illusion of control. Paul, where's the morning report? Steve barked from his desk. Paul rushed in, clutching a thin folder. Here, sir. Sales are steady, but... No, but... Paul, Steve snapped, snatching the folder. I don't pay you to speculate. Just get the numbers in line. Paul's response was cut short as the glass doors of the dealership swung open. A group of sharply dressed men and women entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. At the center of the group was James Carter, his demeanor calm yet authoritative. His tailored suit seemed to catch every ray of light, and the polished leather of his shoes gleamed as he strode in. Steve looked up, squinting. What the hell is this? Paul froze. Steve, I think you should. Steve waved him off and stood, his expression darkening. Stay here. I'll handle it. Striding into the showroom, Steve plastered on a smile. Good morning, folks. Welcome to Miller Luxury Motors. How can we... His words trailed off as James turned to face him, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. Mr. Miller, James said smoothly. Good to see you again. Steve blinked, his brow furrowing. Wait a minute. You were here yesterday, weren't you? I was, James said, his tone even. And I'm here today in a slightly different capacity. Steve glanced at the impeccably dressed group behind James, his smile faltering. Different capacity? What's this about? James gestured toward the group. These are my colleagues from Horizon Motors. We've come to discuss the operations of this dealership. Horizon Motors? Steve repeated, his face pale. What do you mean by operations? James's smile widened slightly. Perhaps we should take this to your office. The air in the dealership grew tense as James and his team followed Steve to his office, leaving Paul and the other staff watching with wide eyes. Inside, Steve motioned for everyone to sit, his movements stiff. All right, he said, forcing a laugh. What's this all about? Some sort of corporate check-in. James took his time sitting, his posture relaxed. You could call it that, he said. As CEO of Horizon Motors, I make it a point to visit our dealerships from time to time. Steve's jaw dropped. CEO? That's right, James said, his eyes steady on Steve's. This dealership is one of many under Horizon Motors. Yesterday, I came in as a customer to observe how you operate. Steve stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You're joking, right? This is some kind of test or something. No joke, James said. But you could call it a test. And I'd say you failed. The room went silent. Steve's face turned a deep shade of red as he stammered. Mr. Carter, if I had known who you were... Exactly, James interrupted, his voice firm. If you had known. Tell me, Mr. Miller, why should it matter who I am? Steve floundered. Well, I didn't mean... Look, yesterday was a busy day. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. James leaned forward, his calm demeanor unnerving. Busy? Misunderstanding? You looked me in the eye and made assumptions based on nothing more than my appearance. That's not fair, Steve blurted. I treat all customers the same. Do you? James asked, his tone icy. Tell me, Mr. Miller, Would you have refused a test drive to a man in a different suit? Or perhaps with a different complexion? Steve stammered, sweat forming on his brow. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just following protocol. Protocol? James raised an eyebrow. I'd like to see this protocol that allows you to dismiss potential customers so easily. Steve's hands shook as he grabbed a folder from his desk, flipping through it aimlessly. I mean, it's more of an unwritten rule. James's gaze hardened. Unwritten, indeed. Let me be clear, Mr. Miller. The culture you've cultivated in this dealership does not align with the values of Horizon Motors. Discrimination, whether intentional or not, has no place in our operations. Steve's laughter was hollow, desperate. Come on, Mr. Carter. You're blowing this out of proportion. We're running a high-end business here. We have to be selective. Selective? James repeated, his voice sharp. You weren't being selective. You were being prejudiced. There's a difference. One of James's colleagues, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard, leaned forward. Mr. Carter, should we discuss the pending evaluation? Evaluation? Steve echoed, his voice cracking. Yes, James said. Every dealership under Horizon Motors undergoes periodic evaluations. Based on yesterday's events, we'll be conducting a thorough review of your operations, starting immediately. Steve's face fell. You can't do that. This is my dealership. It's Horizon Motors dealership, James corrected. You're simply running it for now. The weight of those last two words hung in the air, and Steve slumped in his chair, defeated. Please, Mr. Carter, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I made a mistake. Give me a chance to make it right. James studied him for a moment, then stood. The first step in making it right is acknowledging the problem. You've taken that step, Mr. Miller. Now, it's up to you to decide what kind of leader you want to be. Without another word, James and his team left the office, leaving Steve alone in his humiliation. As James stepped back into the showroom, Paul approached him hesitantly. Mr. Carter, Paul said, his voice low. I just wanted to say thank you. Not everyone stands up to him. James regarded the young man thoughtfully. Leadership isn't about power, Paul. It's about responsibility. Remember that. Paul nodded, his expression resolute, as James and his team walked out, leaving the dealership staff buzzing with whispers. For Steve Miller, the humiliation was only the beginning. For James Carter, it was the first step in turning a toxic environment into a place of growth and inclusion. The dealership was eerily quiet the next day. Steve Miller sat at his desk, his face buried in his hands, the weight of James Carter's words pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The usually bustling showroom seemed lifeless, with employees moving cautiously, whispering among themselves. Steve hadn't spoken to anyone since the team from Horizon Motors left the day before, his embarrassment too raw to address. As the morning dragged on, Steve's assistant, Paul, knocked tentatively on the office door. Steve. Paul's voice was hesitant. Mr. Carter's team is here again. They're in the conference room. Steve looked up sharply. Again? What do they want now? I think it's about the evaluation, Paul said, shifting nervously. Steve cursed under his breath, smoothing his tie as he stood. Fine. Let's get this over with. When he entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. James Carter sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet calm. The other Horizon Motors executives flanked him, their faces unreadable. Good morning, Mr. Miller, James said evenly. Steve swallowed hard. Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting you back. So soon. We believe in addressing issues promptly, James replied. Steve sat, his palms sweating. Look, Mr. Carter, about yesterday. James raised a hand, cutting him off. We're not here to dwell on yesterday. We're here to talk about the future of this dealership. Steve blinked, his stomach churning. The future? James leaned forward, his tone steady. As it stands, this dealership's culture is misaligned with Horizon Motors' values. Our brand represents more than luxury. It represents excellence, respect, and inclusivity. Yesterday, what I witnessed was the opposite. Steve opened his mouth to defend himself, but James continued, his gaze unwavering. Your behavior wasn't just an embarrassment to this dealership, it was an embarrassment to the brand as a whole. You dismissed a customer based on preconceived notions. You created an environment where your staff feels powerless to challenge your authority. That's not leadership, Mr. Miller. That's negligence. Steve's throat felt dry. I understand. And I want to fix it. Good, James said. We're giving you a chance to do just that. But understand this. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. James's colleague, the sharp-eyed woman from the day before, handed Steve a folder. This contains a detailed list of recommendations and required changes, she said crisply. Failure to meet these standards will result in termination of your contract with Horizon Motors. Steve's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Termination? You're serious about this? James's expression softened slightly. Very serious. But I don't believe in tearing people down without offering a way forward. You have an opportunity to change, Mr. Miller. The question is, are you willing to take it? Steve nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. I'll do whatever it takes. James studied him for a moment before speaking. It starts with listening. To your customers, to your staff, and to yourself. Acknowledge your biases and work to overcome them. This isn't just about saving your dealership. It's about becoming the kind of leader people can respect. The meeting ended with Steve feeling both humbled and determined. As the Horizon Motors team left the dealership, Paul approached Steve cautiously. Steve, Paul began, his voice hesitant. Can I say something? Steve sighed, running a hand through his hair. Go ahead, Paul. I think Mr. Carter is right, Paul said, his voice gaining strength. We've all seen it. The way you treat certain customers, the way you dismiss people. It's not just yesterday. It's been happening for a long time. Steve stiffened. You're saying I'm the problem? Paul hesitated, but pressed on. I'm saying we all have room to grow. You can't keep running this place like it's your personal kingdom. People are watching and they notice. Steve's initial anger faded as Paul's words sank in. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how deeply his attitude had affected not just the customers, but his employees as well. By the end of the day, Steve called a meeting with his staff. The group gathered in the showroom, their expressions wary. I won't take up too much of your time, Steve began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. I need to say something. The employees exchanged glances, but remained silent. Yesterday, I made a mistake, Steve continued. A big one. And it's not the first time. I've been running this dealership the wrong way, thinking only about myself, ignoring the people who make this place work. Paul looked at him, his eyes wide with surprise. Steve cleared his throat. Things are going to change around here. Starting today, we're implementing new policies to create a better environment for everyone. That means treating every customer with respect, no matter who they are. And it means listening to all of you. If you see something wrong, I want to hear about it. One of the senior sales associates, a man named Greg, raised his hand. Does this mean we're finally getting training on how to handle these situations? Because honestly, a lot of us don't know what to do when things like this happen. Yes, Steve said firmly. We'll be bringing in experts to help us improve. It's long overdue. The staff murmured among themselves, their expressions softening. For the first time in a long time, Steve seemed genuine. After the meeting, Paul approached Steve. That was unexpected, he said carefully. Steve gave a tired smile. It's a start. I've got a lot to learn, Paul. But I'm ready to try. As the dealership began to close for the day, James Carter watched from his car parked across the street. He saw Steve walking out, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his stride purposeful. James smiled faintly. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. For Steve Miller, the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time, he was willing to take the journey. The weeks that followed were nothing short of transformative for the dealership. Under the scrutiny of Horizon Motors, Steve Miller's reign of unchecked arrogance came to a grinding halt. It wasn't easy, nor was it smooth. The dealership's employees, long accustomed to Steve's abrasive style, were skeptical about the sudden shift. In the staff room, Greg leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. So, What's the over-under on Steve actually sticking with this new and improved act? He asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Paul, seated at a nearby table, shrugged. Honestly, I think he's serious this time. Yeah, right, Greg snorted. Steve Miller, champion of equality and inclusivity. I'll believe it when I see it. Paul frowned. He's trying. Yesterday, he apologized to a customer for being dismissive. I've never seen him do that before. Apologized? Greg's eyebrows shot up. To a customer? Must be the end of the world. Their conversation was interrupted by Steve entering the room. The staff quieted immediately, the tension palpable. Steve cleared his throat, looking more uncomfortable than usual. I wanted to say something before the training session starts, he began, his voice uncertain. The room remained silent, the employees exchanging wary glances. I know I haven't been the best boss, Steve admitted. I've let my ego get in the way of running this place the way it should be run. And that's hurt a lot of people, customers and staff alike. Paul leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Steve. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I've got it all figured out, Steve continued. But I'm committed to doing better. For all of you. And for this dealership. A few murmurs rippled through the room, but no one spoke up. Steve shifted awkwardly, then nodded. All right, that's all. Let's get to work. As the employees filed out, Greg nudged Paul. Well, I'll give him this. He's got guts showing his face in here. Paul shot him a look. Give him a chance, Greg. People can change. The training session was led by a diversity and inclusion expert brought in by Horizon Motors. The session was intense, with scenarios and exercises designed to challenge biases and foster empathy. Steve, seated in the front row, participated actively, though it was clear he was out of his comfort zone. At one point, the trainer asked the group to share a moment when they realized they had acted unfairly toward someone. Steve hesitated, then raised his hand. I'll go, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous glances from his staff. The room turned to him, curiosity mixed with disbelief. A few weeks ago, Steve began, I dismissed a customer because I assumed he wasn't serious about buying a car. I judged him based on his appearance. Turns out, that man was my boss, the CEO of Horizon Motors. The staff exchanged shocked looks. Greg muttered, well, that explains a lot. Steve ignored him, continuing. It was a wake-up call. One I needed. And it made me realize how often I've let my assumptions guide my decisions, not just with customers, but with all of you. The room was silent as Steve sat back down. For the first time, his vulnerability felt real, not calculated. Later that day, James Carter made an unannounced visit to the dealership. He entered quietly, observing the staff as they worked. There was a noticeable difference. The air of tension had lessened, replaced by cautious optimism. Paul spotted James and hurried over. Mr. Carter, it's good to see you. James smiled. How are things going, Paul? Paul hesitated, then nodded. Better, I think. Steve's really trying. It's strange, but in a good way. James glanced toward Steve, who was in the middle of assisting a customer. His posture was relaxed, his tone polite. Strange can be good, James said. Growth is never comfortable. Paul nodded. He even apologized to us during training. I didn't think I'd ever see that. James's smile widened. That's a start. As James approached Steve, the dealership owner looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. Mr. Carter, Steve said, straightening. I wasn't expecting you. I like to keep people on their toes, James replied. How are things progressing? Steve glanced around, taking in the activity of his staff. We've still got a long way to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction. James nodded. Good. Remember, it's not about perfection, it's about consistency. Every step forward matters. Steve hesitated, then said, I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me. You could have fired me on the spot, but you didn't. James regarded him thoughtfully. I believe in second chances, Mr. Miller, but it's up to you to prove you deserve it. Steve nodded. I won't let you down. As James turned to leave, he paused. One more thing, Mr. Miller. Yes. James's gaze was steady. Leadership isn't just about numbers and policies. It's about people. Never forget that. Steve watched as James walked out, his words lingering like a challenge. For Steve, the path to redemption was just beginning. But for the first time, he felt capable of meeting it head-on, armed with the knowledge that change, while difficult, was always within reach. Months passed, and the transformation of the dealership was undeniable. What had once been an environment defined by arrogance and exclusion had blossomed into a place of mutual respect and growth. The change wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but it was real. Steve Miller stood in the middle of the showroom one afternoon, watching as his employees worked with confidence and enthusiasm. For the first time, he saw genuine smiles, not just the forced politeness that had once permeated the space. "Steve," Paul called, walking up to him with a clipboard in hand. "Got a minute?" "Sure, Paul. What's up?" Paul handed over the clipboard. "Sales numbers for the quarter. We're up 15% compared to last year." Steve's eyebrows shot up. 15%. Paul nodded, grinning. "Turns out, treating people with respect is good for business." Steve let out a dry laugh. Who would have thought? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Carter. His presence, as always, commanded attention, but this time, it was met with warmth rather than tension. "Mr. Carter," Steve greeted, stepping forward with a smile. "Good to see you." James shook his hand firmly.
"Steve."
"I thought I'd stop by and see how things are going." Steve gestured around the showroom. "See for yourself. Things are better than ever." James looked around, observing the employees interacting with customers and each other. He nodded approvingly. "I can see that. The energy here is completely different." "It's thanks to you," Steve said. James tilted his head. "No, Steve. It's thanks to you. I gave you an opportunity, but you chose to take it. That's what matters." Steve's expression softened. "I still have a lot to learn, but I'm trying every day." "That's all anyone can ask," James replied. As they walked through the dealership, James stopped to speak with the employees, asking about their experiences and suggestions. The conversations were candid, filled with gratitude for the changes that had taken place. One of the newer sales associates, a young black woman named Maya, approached James shyly. "Mr. Carter, can I just say thank you for everything?" James smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me, Maya. You're part of what makes this place better." Maya glanced at Steve, her expression hesitant. "It's been a huge difference working here since things changed. Mr. Miller's different now." Steve nodded, his face slightly red. "I'm a work in progress, Maya. But I appreciate your patience." As the day wound down, James and Steve sat in Steve's office. A photo on the desk caught James's eye, Steve and his employees at a team-building event. Everyone looked happy, a stark contrast to the dealership's earlier days. "You've come a long way, Steve," James said. Steve followed his gaze to the photo and smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without your push. That day you walked in here," he shook his head. "It changed everything." James leaned forward slightly. "It wasn't just about that day, Steve. It was about what you chose to do after. Change isn't a single moment, it's a series of decisions. And you made the right ones." Steve nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned something important through all of this. Leadership isn't about power or control. It's about service. To your employees, to your customers, to your community." James smiled. "Exactly. And that's what makes a business truly successful." As James prepared to leave, Steve walked him to the door. The two men shook hands, their mutual respect evident. "Thank you again, Mr. Carter," Steve said sincerely. "Call me James," he replied with a smile. "And remember, every day is a chance to do better. Don't waste it." Steve watched as James walked out into the sunshine, a sense of gratitude washing over him. The man who had entered his dealership months ago as a customer had left as a mentor, changing not just the business, but Steve's entire outlook on life. Inside, Paul approached Steve with a grin. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but you're actually not terrible to work for these days." Steve laughed, shaking his head. "Don't push your luck, Paul. The two of them shared a genuine moment of camaraderie before returning to their work, the dealership now a thriving example of what could happen when respect and accountability became the foundation of leadership. For Steve Miller, the journey wasn't over, but the hardest part was behind him. And for James Carter, it was another victory in a much larger fight. A reminder that change, though difficult, was always possible with the right choices and the courage to make them.